During the war, the mail was not just a way to send messages. In the Third Reich, it was part of state power. If a letter passed through the official bags, the sorting rooms, and the stamps, then the state had already accepted it as real. But there came a moment when Hitler's own postal system began working against him. Not an underground press, not an agent behind the lines, not a hidden radio operator. The official machinery of the Reich began delivering letters that quietly undermined trust in the regime. For a long time, this story sounded like a legend. Too strange, too humiliating, too perfect to be true. But declassified OSS records showed that it was real. It was Operation Cornflakes. Today, we are going to break down how American intelligence found a weakness not in Germany's defenses, but in its habits, its procedures, and its blind faith in its own order. In a totalitarian state, the mail is never just logistics. It is part of control. A letter that passes through the official system is treated as a legitimate piece of the state machine. It could be delayed, opened, or inspected. But if it reached the recipient, then the system had already marked it as one of its own. In wartime Germany, that mattered even more. The postal network was built into the railways, the bureaucracy, and the military infrastructure. Bags, wagons, routes, sorting stations, stamps, and ledgers turned ordinary correspondence into part of a huge administrative structure. For ordinary people, a stamped letter meant authenticity. For officials, it meant order. For military administrators, it meant the system was still functioning. The logic of the Reich rested on one simple belief. If the form looks familiar, then it can be trusted. That is why the idea of an enemy using this system against Germany seemed absurd. You could spread a rumor, you could drop leaflets, you could broadcast disinformation by radio, but forcing the state machine of the enemy to deliver hostile propaganda with its own hands sounded impossible. And that was not only how German officials thought. That was how the Allies thought too, until war began to break the normal logic of the system. Railways were overloaded, mail cars moved with other trains, air raids shattered transport lines, and wherever a strike hit the tracks, there was a short, violent moment when the priority was no longer inspection, but restoring movement as fast as possible. And inside that crack, a new idea appeared. An idea that would later be called cornflakes. The Allies realized that bombing a mail train could become more than sabotage. It could become an entry point. If new mailbags appeared beside the wreckage and looked no different from the real ones, then the German system might pick them up, fold them into the stream, and carry them to their destinations. The plan was bold because it was simple. Do not storm the system. Do not break it from the outside. Do not bribe the people running it. Make it accept a lie as a continuation of its own work. And in that moment, the central rule of the story collapses. Total control is not all-powerful because it depends on routine. The more a system trusts its own signs, the more dangerous a perfect imitation becomes. If you try to find one single hero in this story, you immediately go in the wrong direction. Cornflakes is not the story of one brilliant spy. At the center of it is not a man, but a hidden machine of war. The real protagonist is an OSS operational group, working at the crossroads of intelligence, black propaganda printing, and psychological warfare. These were not front-line soldiers, and they were not cinematic spies. Their weapons were paper forms, seals, envelopes, plausibility, and a precise understanding of how bureaucracy makes decisions. By this point, the OSS already understood something crucial. Modern war is not fought only at the front. More and more, it is decided by who can make the enemy misread reality. Not just deceive him once, but insert falsehood into the process by which he understands the world. That was the work of these teams. They studied not only armies and headquarters, but language letter formats, official habits, visual signs of authority, and the psychology of trust. They were interested in everything that makes a system say this belongs to us. The task in front of them was almost impossible. It was not enough to create a fake letter. It was not enough to write a propaganda message. They had to achieve something far more dangerous. They had to make the enemy accept the forgery as part of his own order and spread it across the country with his own hands. That turned the operation into an attack not on defenses, but on trust itself. The mail did not just need to let hostile material pass. It needed to recognize it as a legitimate part of its own system. And that is where the central danger appeared. If the forgery was too crude, it would be exposed immediately. If it was too elaborate, it would fall apart in execution. If the text sounded like obvious enemy agitation, it would never reach the target. The lie had to be quiet, ordinary, familiar. That is why the real protagonist here is not a man with a revolver and a password. It is a group of people trying to break into an entire state through its routines. They were not forcing doors open. They were studying which doors opened automatically. Now the idea had to become mechanics. It was not enough for the OSS to understand that the German postal system was vulnerable in moments of chaos. They had to figure out exactly how mail moved through the Reich, where sorting happened, how bags were marked, what real envelopes looked like, and which small details made postal workers trust what they were seeing. Germany's wartime mail system moved with the railways. Mail cars traveled alongside other trains. Bags were transferred under pressure. The flow was enormous, which meant authenticity was usually judged not by the content of a letter, but by its form. First the bag, then the marking, then the paper, then the stamp, then the address. That is why the preparation for cornflakes became almost an engineering problem. OSS specialists studied how to reproduce the visual language of German mail so precisely that the enemy's eye would move across the forgery without stopping. They were not imitating a letter as an object. They were imitating familiarity as an effect. Black propaganda was essential to that. This was not a leaflet dropped from the sky. It was not a loud message from outside. Black propaganda had to look internal. It had to sound like a voice from inside the enemy's world. Its strength was not in shouting, but in slipping through unnoticed. But printing letters was only one part of the job. The operation required several moving pieces working together. Printers had to produce convincing letters and inserts. Forgery specialists had to recreate the attributes of official postal delivery. Planners had to choose the right moment when an airstrike would produce exactly the right scene of confusion. And aviation had to synchronize the bombing with the later drop. Out of that came the hard formula of cornflakes. First the strike on the postal transport, then the confusion at the site, then the appearance of new bags, then the routine reaction of the German side. If everything worked, the enemy himself would complete the final and most important stage. A small but telling detail became the symbol of the operation. The fake stamp that played on the words and read Futsches Reich. At first glance, it was just a tiny piece of paper, but that was the whole logic of cornflakes. The regime rested on seals, emblems, stamps, and signs of official authority. So striking at the symbol meant striking at the state's claim to infallibility. And yet every detail carried risk. The paper might feel wrong. The layout might look unnatural. The bag markings might raise suspicion. The forgery had to survive the quick glance of a man who was not actively looking for deception but who lived by form. If it failed that glance, the operation died at the point of entry. If the plan failed, cornflakes would become nothing more than a bizarre propaganda stunt. But if it worked, then the blow would land in the most sensitive place imaginable. It would reveal that the Reich did not fully control even its own channels of trust. And this is where the operation ran into its greatest limit. Everything up to this point, analysis, printing, packaging, route calculations, coordination with aircraft, was still in the hands of the people who designed the plan. But beyond that lay a zone they could not control. Between the fake mailbag and the real recipient stood the most dangerous figure in the entire story. An ordinary German postal employee. Not a famous counterintelligence officer, not a grand strategist, just a man who picked up a bag, checked a marking, sorted it forward, or stopped it because something felt wrong. That was the crisis of cornflakes. The Allies could create the illusion. They could insert material at the right place. But they could not order the Reich to take the final step. The enemy had to take that step himself willingly, and without realizing he had already entered someone else's script. After an air raid, there is smoke, wreckage, scattered bags, urgency, and cleanup. People move fast because the line has to be restored, and inside that speed lies the chance for insertion. But inside it also lies the mortal danger. One extra moment of suspicion, and the whole structure collapses. For Cornflakes, the real threat was not a genius intelligence officer. It was a careful functionary. One sorter who notices something slightly wrong in the markings, the paper, the addresses, or the overall look of the bag. The operation could die not because of dramatic exposure, but because of dull professional attention. That is why the middle of this story hangs on its hardest question. Can an operation really be called successful if its fate depends not on the intelligence officers who planned it, but on the reactions of random enemy clerks and workers? The forgery had to pass through invisible gates. The bag had to be picked up. It had to avoid being set aside. It had to be folded into the stream. It had to be opened, sorted, and moved. Then the letters had to reach hands that would open them as ordinary mail, not as evidence. Failure at this stage looked almost inevitable. Too many variables, too little direct control, too much dependence on the enemy's routines. Cornflakes was being released into a dark river, and no one could know if it would break against the first stone or drift all the way to its target. But that vulnerability is exactly what made the operation so dangerous. It was testing how deeply a totalitarian state trusted its own routine. If the German system behaved automatically, Cornflakes lived. If it began to think too carefully, Cornflakes died. And here the story turns. This is the moment that makes Cornflakes one of the most refined operations of the war. Its strength was not in smashing the system by force, but in dissolving into its normal activity. After a strike on the railway, after shattered wagons, smoke emergency cleanup, and frantic transfers, everything around German postal workers tells them the same thing. Restore movement as fast as possible. War takes away the time required for doubt. It pushes bureaucracy to choose automatic action over inspection. That reflex is where the turning point lives. The fake bags do not look like an intrusion. They look like part of the aftermath. They sit among the things that already need to be collected, sorted, and moved. The faster the German system tries to restore order, the more precisely it follows the script written by its enemy. What the enemy faces here is not a crude lie, but a bureaucratic mirage. The letters look like letters. The paper looks convincing. The bags are embedded in a familiar scene of destruction and urgency. Everything on the surface belongs to the world postal workers already know, and that is when the humiliation begins. The Third Reich starts working against itself, not because someone inside consciously betrays the system, not because counterintelligence collapses, but because the state machine trusts its rituals more than reality. Cornflakes stops being just a story about letters and becomes a story about trust. Victory here belongs not to the side with more force, but to the side that understood the architecture of the enemy's system more deeply. The Allies did not find a gap in the front line. They found a habit, the habit that says if the form is familiar, then it is safe. And what makes this so humiliating for the Reich is that the defeat comes not from disaster, but from normality. What should have been a sign of strength, discipline, speed recovery, trust in procedure becomes the source of vulnerability. From that point on, the lie is living inside enemy logistics. It moves on the same routes, passes through the same hands, and enters the same homes and offices that were supposed to be protected by the official system, all of it carried under German signs of order. That is the cruel irony of Cornflakes. A state built on control ends up moving hostile material across its own territory with its own hands. At this point, it is important not to exaggerate. Cornflakes did not win the war. It was not a miracle weapon. It was not the operation that caused Germany to collapse. But that is not why it matters. Cornflakes proved that even a state built on total control is vulnerable in the most ordinary channels through which it communicates with its own population. Until then, psychological warfare was usually understood as something external. Radio from the other side of the front, leaflets falling from the sky, rumors carried into the rear. Cornflakes changed that logic. Now hostile material could arrive not from outside, but through an official and familiar route. That made the effect far more dangerous. Propaganda did not appear as an invasion. It appeared as normality. For the Third Reich, this was a blow to the image of infallible order. A totalitarian state depends not only on fear, but on the performance of flawless control. It must appear all-seeing, all-attentive, and fully capable of distinguishing its own material from everything foreign. If its mail can become the carrier of enemy letters, then it is not just one failure. It is a crack in the myth of the entire system. In strategic terms, Cornflakes expanded what the Allies understood about hidden war. It showed that you could fight not only for bridges, fuel depots, and rail lines. You could fight for routines, habits, and automatic reactions. You could attack the channels of trust themselves and make them work against the power that depends on them. That was the lesson for Allied planners. Disinformation was no longer limited to blunt forgeries or one-time tricks. It could be woven into the enemy's daily process. And the more disciplined that process was, the easier it could be turned against itself. There was another lesson too. Cornflakes showed that a modern state can lose not only at the front, it can lose in its habit of believing its own signs of authenticity. It can fail to notice the moment when its own systems of communication and delivery begin serving an enemy will. That is the real significance of the operation. Not the scale of destruction, but the precision of the diagnosis. Cornflakes identified the nervous system of the regime and proved that it could be struck not only with bombs, but with a well-timed insertion into its own daily procedures. After the war, Cornflakes did not become one of the famous legends of intelligence history. It had no single glamorous hero, no simple myth, and no dramatic final scene that was easy to retell. So for a long time, the story faded into the shadows. That is not surprising. Operations like this are hard to preserve in public memory. There is no one battle, no one shot, no one signed order after which everything becomes obvious. What matters here is hidden in the mechanism itself. A state system begins acting against itself without realizing it. But the story did not disappear completely. Over time, archives surfaced, internal records appeared, OSS documents emerged, and later larger bodies of declassified material. Slowly it became clear that Cornflakes was not a wartime tall tale or a clever story invented after the fact. It was a real operation in which mail logistics and propaganda were fused into one unexpected design. That return through the archives is exactly what makes the story so powerful today. Because Cornflakes is no longer just about paper letters, stamps, and wartime railways. It is about something larger. The vulnerability of a system often hides not in weakness, but in confidence. The more familiar a procedure becomes and the more automatic the trust in it, the easier it becomes to turn that procedure into a channel for someone else's will. That is why the ending of this story is not about one man. It is about the principle the operation revealed. Cornflakes shows that any large system can be wounded through its habits. You do not always have to break the armor. Sometimes it is enough to understand which signs the system believes in, which procedures it treats as unquestionable, and at what point it starts trusting form more than origin. In that sense, this story reaches far beyond the Second World War. Yes, the setting is a world of trains, bags, paper letters, and stamps. But the logic of the operation feels disturbingly modern. Systems fail when they stop distinguishing between what is familiar and what is true, when signs of authenticity matter more than verification, when ritual starts replacing thought. That is why Cornflakes matters not as a curious wartime anecdote, but as a warning. A totalitarian state can be humiliated not only by defeat at the front, but by the fact that it ends up carrying hostile material across its own territory with its own hands. The mail of the Third Reich was supposed to symbolize control. Instead, it became proof that even the harshest order can one day begin serving someone else's design. And inside that quiet paper, almost invisible substitution lies one of the most humiliating failures of the entire era.